you've asked. Here are your answers. I'm going through the comments and I have so many amazing questions. I want to address as many as I can. And this video will make it relatively short and sweet. Starting out with our very first super sticker comment. Thank you so much to Aunt Ma1Lbag. Answer her question and a whole lot more in just a moment. Welcome to True Crime, Faith, and Chocolate. I'm your host, Annette Lyon, true crime junkie, woman of faith, and USA Today bestselling author of the suspense novel Just One More and a whole bunch of other stuff. Ma1Lbag asked if I had listened to the YouTuber who goes by PD Questions. I did watch his video. But what she is asking, I think he's a lawyer, not sure, but he has a great theory on Pryor's defense strategy, starting with why he asked to withdraw as Chad's attorney. It would also explain why Chad kept so quiet. He thinks Pryor had a plan from the beginning in the appellate process to get Chad off. That's why it seemed he wanted the death penalty. Please, I would really like to know what you think. I loved your book. I give it 20 stars. I hope you have more. So thank you on all those counts. So I consulted some lawyers. One attorney who he is a public defender, actually. And I thought, who better to ask? He does not work in Idaho. Through PD Questions videos. Backing up for those, just to clarify the order of events. In Idaho, anyone who has a capital case, meaning eligible for the death penalty, is given death penalty certified public defenders. I believe they get at least 2 on their case if you can't hire your own attorney. And they have to be death penalty certified if they are public defenders, because they have to be qualified and give good, effective counsel. So they have to be certified for those things. If they are provided by the state, they have to be on that level. If a defendant decides to hire their own counsel, they can hire whoever they want. They can even represent themselves. They don't even need counsel. It's up to the defendant who they pick. Chad chose to go with John Pryor. He hired John Pryor. John Pryor is not death penalty certified, or he wasn't until this case. He is now, ironically, I believe, because one of the biggest thing you have to do is to be on the team that tries a death penalty case. Pryor now qualifies on that count. Also 2024 leading up to Chad's case, Pryor, it sounded like he was trying to get off the case or put forth like, okay, I want to withdraw as Chad Daybell's attorney, saying he can't pay me anymore. I can't do this by myself, which, Chad has been declared indigent. His house now belongs to Pryor as payment. As we learned, it is a lot for one person. I'm sure it was a very tough trial on many counts. He had also been on the case for years, and he could have withdrawn much earlier, many, many times. And there were several times, and I don't know the dates, I can go look, but they're not that relevant right now, so I didn't. Boyce asked Chad, and even in his own chambers, if I understand correctly, privately, saying, do you want Pryor to be your counsel, or do you want a public defender? And multiple times, Chad said, I want Pryor. I don't want a public defender. I want Pryor. So that's his choice. The official request to withdraw as Chad's attorney, I believe it was the last week of February or the first couple days of March 2024. And jury selection was to begin April 1st. So if Pryor's saying he didn't have enough time as one person to get ready for it in years, how is anyone supposed to get ready for it in 1 month? Dude. So of course Boyce said, no, you have had years to withdraw. You didn't. The defendant has stated multiple times he wants you as counsel. That's what we're going with, because that's how it is. In some of the early hearings, and this is what PD Questions going all the way back, now we're finally getting to his question. Some of what he proposes, and he brings up some of the recordings of early hearings of Pryor saying, I don't want to reveal my strategy and this and that and the other. But some of what Pryor said in some of these earlier hearings about counsel, it does sound like what PD Questions is proposing on some level, which is that Chad is hoping to get his case overturned because of ineffective counsel because of all of this stuff, that he didn't have access to tax dollars that would have given him a full team, because once you choose your private counsel, you don't get the state public defender money. The idea that he's entitled to fair representation paid for by the state, but he didn't get that, except that he chose not to get it. You can't have your private attorney counsel and public at the same time. You can't double dip. But it sounds like he was setting it up as an attempt to appeal. This is what the public defender I reached out to, he said. That he says, I do think this guy is trying to set up an appeal and felt like his mitigation was inadequate to escape the death penalty, so he thinks he'll have a better chance at appeal to overturn the conviction. I don't think this is going to happen. In fact, he actually goes on to say, it sounds like private counsel and not death qualified, which is the case for Pryor. And so they may be pursuing an ineffective assistance of counsel argument for a new trial, which I think we all agree is likely what is happening. In fact, that is the most common appeal that happens after any kind of conviction, is ineffective counsel. It makes sense. And in fact, it's automatic. Some people have actually asked, like, well, why has Chad already appealed if he wants to be a martyr? I don't know if he wants to be a martyr. I suspect he does, as in his own little egotistical brain. He would see himself as a martyr, and any few remaining cultists might see that too. The rest of us wouldn't see that, but, we're not in his little narcissistic brain. He doesn't have the option. Death penalties are automatically appealed, period. He can withdraw future appeals potentially, but it has to happen. This lawyer goes on, if he were to win the idea of saying ineffective assistance and then tried to get a new trial, and backing up on that one too. The interesting thing is, if you look at cases where they're arguing ineffective assistance, they have to show that with a different lawyer, there's a good chance that the jury would have come up with a different decision. Not just, is there a better lawyer out there? It's, would any better lawyer have done anything that would have, in all likelihood, changed the jury's verdict from what we got? And that's a pretty high bar to clear. It has to be pretty compelling, and those things don't get overturned very easily. Even in cases where I believe that ineffective counsel has been shown and whatnot, sometimes it's still not enough to get a new trial because they haven't shown that the jury would have made a different decision, even with better counsel. Even if Chad were to win on ineffective counsel and be granted a new trial, wouldn't necessarily overturn everything, but if he's granted a new trial, this lawyer says, that would likely give him a plea opportunity to take the death penalty off the table and avoid a second trial. And that makes sense, that if assuming that Chad is not trying to be a martyr after all, which again, he may or may not be, it's a possibility. If he's not, then this makes sense, the PD questions put forth, in a sense that he's trying to get a second trial so that he can potentially get the death penalty off the table as part of a plea. Now, he was given a plea option before the trial ever happened. If he pled guilty, he could have had the death penalty removed already. He chose not to because I think he was arrogant enough to think he could win and be found not guilty. Because he's just that arrogant and yeah. I don't think that he will win on this count. The idea that he deserves private counsel as well as state-funded counsel, it's one or the other, dude. And I don't think I think PD Questions was trying to say it would be unconstitutional to prevent a defendant from having the state counsel as well as the private, if that private is not DP qualified. So, whether that's something maybe that the Idaho Supreme Court would have to take up, or maybe even the U.S. Supreme Court, and that could take decades. Although, don't want to get too political here, but if you look at Project 2025, the GOP side of things, the current candidate is actually hoping to death penalties easier to give and then quicker to carry out, which is, in my mind, problematic on a lot of counts. That lawyer agreed that that's probably the strategy the Pryor is trying to approach, but probably not to get him off, because a second trial, there's so much evidence against him. A second trial would almost definitely give him the same verdict. if he were to be granted a second trial based on ineffective counsel, he might just use that instead to negotiate life in prison instead. And that would get him back into probably a regular prison rather than the high security and solitary. That's a definite theory. I feel like that's what Pryor's strategy is. He actually even used that word, but I don't think it's going to work. For years, he had the opportunity to avail himself of death penalty qualified counsel, and he chose not to. And so you can't then blame that on the state. Next question. 2. Does anyone believe that someone killed Alex? Yes, a lot of people do. I'm a little torn on it. For the longest time, I have thought that yes, someone did him in, or he did himself in, especially because he went to Mexico the day before he died, where we know he and others have bought illegal drugs. At the same time, we know that in his autopsy, blood clots were found in his lungs. He was a truck driver, and truck drivers tend to get blood clots because you're sitting in one position for so long. I am wondering whether there was something else, if the blood clots were there but weren't necessarily what killed him, or if there is something that can create blood clots or exacerbate existing ones. I don't know, but I found it fascinating that, and I'll be doing a dive into the interview that Nate Eaton of East Idaho News did with Detective Hermosillo and prosecutor Rob Wood. Excellent interview. Hermosillo says that he thinks it was natural causes. He trusts the Arizona autopsy. And he says the reason he trusts it is because they knew, law enforcement and the medical examiner's office in Arizona knew about the case already. They thought it was a suspicious death. So they were looking for toxicology. They were looking for something else and did not find anything else. So I find it interesting that Hermosillo thinks it was probably natural causes. If it was, maybe Alex's conscience that get him in finally, because the timing is just so coincidental. It also wouldn't surprise me if there's some way, I mean, those blood clots were there, but something that hastened them or something, I don't know. 3. Cinebase6127, who said, I have a disturbing theory on her changing her appearance, referring to Emma, Chad's daughter, who testified, all robotically and gross and scripted. She says, at first, with her looking like Tammy, so if you've seen, I'll put pictures up here of what she looked like when her mother died, and then when she looked like on the stand. So looking like Tammy, and then Lori. Cinebe says, I thought she was imitating a mother figure, especially with her acting so childish, which she absolutely did, sticking her tongue out behind a reporter and all that gross stuff. So you can go watch that video. I realize she isn't clinging to the mother figures. She's trying to turn herself into the woman her father is romantic with, Cinebe says. And she goes on, even the blessing thing you mentioned, getting blessings from Chad instead of her husband, I think Sigmund Freud could have had a field day on this girl. Agreed. She seems to be making herself into a surrogate wife. The absolute contempt she has for Tammy supports it too. So here's my response to that. I agree, 100%. Creepy. In fact, Freud describes something like that. We have the Oedipus complex is like when a boy is loving his mother. Freud had the flip side when it's a girl with her father, being the Electra complex. And and this is not to say that there was anything sexual going on between father and daughter, but it's if she's trying to get his attention and his love and his approval and acceptance. She admires him more than her own husband. She is drawn to those things. She's trying to mimic and like make herself into the image of the woman that her father clearly is attracted to. First, Tammy. And she looked a lot like her mother, and then now she's almost unrecognizable and looks a whole lot more like Lori, which is so creepy. So I agree that Emma is trying to get her dad's approval and love, and that's just Electra complex, yeah. And Dr. John Mathias from Hidden True Crime agrees as well, that sounds like she's on some level trying to get his approval by emulating Lori now. 4. Peggy did ask if he wants to be a martyr, why is he appealing? I think I may have answered some of that, in part because the first appeal, it's automatic. If you have a capital case and that's what the sentence is, it's automatic. He can't, it has to happen. So he may as well just go ahead and file it because it's inevitable. He would have to, after that, I don't know how many appeals are automatic, but there's several, I think. And then he would have to then actively say, let's stop the appeals. If PD Question's idea is correct and he is a strategy to try to get a negotiation into removing the death penalty so it's life in prison instead of a new trial, that could be a strategy he's attempting. I don't think it's going to work. That was his decision. As I've said, I don't think the best qualified lawyers could have gotten him off. There's just too much evidence. Too much. 5. Allison 2649 said, we've seen multiple jurors do interviews, and a couple of them were asked if they were LDS and if they knew or not just how many of their fellow jurors were LDS, and they answered that they had no idea if the others were LDS or not. They never discussed it. Kind of odd. At least one juror was raised Mormon, and he said he was no longer. I don't think he actually said he was no longer, just that he was raised Mormon or raised LDS, and then left it at that. He probably isn't. I don't think I ever heard him say he's not. Just want to clarify that. She goes, I bring this up only because this means that when the jurors were finally able to discuss the case with each other, not one of them asked any questions regarding the faith. Not one of them wanted to know if it was actually LDS doctrine or if Mormons were raised to think a certain way. If they had, then the ones with experience would have educated them, shed some light, but apparently not. Interesting. Just a random thought I've had. Kind of like what I said in my juror response video. Nick did say that there were some questions he answered that were about more of the smaller things about the faith that probably because they live in Idaho, almost everybody, even if they're not Latter-day Saint, they would have come across someone who is. It's a relatively high population, especially in Rexburg, that they would know the most of what they heard was complete bogus and absolute BS. But it would have been the smaller things that they wouldn't necessarily know and that they would ask Nick about. I think it also goes to show, though, that the case really wasn't about religion per se. Religion was an excuse. And the evidence that convicted Chad, it was the texts, it was the GPS, life insurance money, the remains of the children on his property. There's so much evidence. His beliefs were a vehicle, and what LDS belief actually is didn't really matter. 6. Plump Ups ask, who on earth might see Chad as a martyr? A martyr because he was a prepper, because he was a Mormon? I'm not getting it. A martyr for what cause? This would only be in his head and for any little cultist still following him, because he's just that arrogant. If he actually believes this stuff, and I don't know if he does. I think Lori does. I don't know that he does. He would be a martyr in his eyes, in Lori's eyes, and any remaining followers like Melanie Pulowski. And that would be it. It's not for anyone else. It would be, I'm a martyr for my cause. I will go down as a martyr in his head in the eternal books or something. It's not a martyr in anyone else's head at all. 7. Penelope Roberts 9212 says, if Chad Daybell had wanted the death penalty, why did he not plead guilty rather than try to blame the world and its wife and his wife? Maybe. I think he thought he would get off. In short, I think he thought he would get off. He would be not guilty. He'd get out because he's that stupid or arrogant or delusional or fill in your descriptor. I don't think he thought he would be found guilty, but planned ahead of time, knowing he's going to be found guilty, most likely. There's too much evidence. So I think that's why he planned the idea of, well, okay, we're going to try to get me to withdraw, and then that won't work, and then we'll end up with trying to plead ineffective counsel so he can maybe get a new trial, but they're not actually going to do a new trial, so he can then plead for life in prison. I think all of that was Pryor's doing because Chad thought he would get off. He could have pled. The date, I think March 31st, he could have pled. And even April 10th, as after the trial began, he could have pled, and then they would have given him life. But he was arrogant enough to think he could get away with it. 8. Libby Franson 7053 says, new LDS temple being built in Rexburg, announced on the same day Chad got the death penalty. Coincidence? Optics are not good. So I wanted to clarify, this wasn't a question so much. There is a new LDS temple being built in Rexburg. But it was not announced on the day of Chad's sentencing. It was announced months ago. In fact, I will look it up and maybe I'll put it up here somewhere, the actual date it was announced. Temples are generally announced twice a year during the general conferences, which are the first weekend of April and the first weekend of October. It was announced, I'm sure, a couple of years ago. They announced the location after that. The groundbreaking was scheduled, and that's what happened the same day that Chad received his sentencing. It was the groundbreaking, and the groundbreaking had been on the books for weeks by that point, because there's a lot to coordinate, because you always have at least one apostle coming, and so there's travel and all kinds of security issues and whatnot. A lot to coordinate for a groundbreaking type of event. Nobody knew that he would be sentenced on a Saturday. Nobody expected that. You get people who went to CrimeCon, they were all just totally unexpected. They were like, oh, I thought the trial would be done by now. So Nate Eaton was in Tennessee when it all came down. Nobody expected it to be on that day. And I'm not sure why she said optics are not good, because I don't know what that would have to do with anything. But yeah, it wasn't that the temple was announced. It was the groundbreaking that happened on the same day. And Saturdays are very common for groundbreakings. To clarify just a bit more, there are going to be 2 temples in Rexburg. One is already built. That is the one on the left. The photograph there, you can see it was announced December 2003, dedicated February 2008. There is going to be a second one. The one on the right is now called Teton River Idaho Temple, just to distinguish it, even though it will be in the Rexburg area. And that is not a photograph, it is a rendering, because it's not built yet. So that's the one, the Teton River, that was on June 1st, had its groundbreaking. So just to clarify, so the Rexburg Temple is already built and dedicated, but there was a second one in Rexburg that is going to be built and had its groundbreaking on June 1st. 9. I've had several people, which is to be expected, you bring up faith in any way, shape, or form, they're like, oh, well, the Mormon Church is at fault because it's their teachings that were the root of all of this, and blah, blah. And so here's my big response. Assuming these comments are in good faith. Some of them clearly are not. Some of them are just trolls. But if you're atheist, I can respect that. If you're agnostic, I can respect that. If you're of another faith, I can respect that. Please don't call me a heathen. I believe in Jesus Christ and in the Bible, so I consider myself a Christian, even though many Christians do not consider Latter-day Saints Christian. But I don't think you can take a cult leader and then say that their root source religion therefore is responsible and must be condemned. Because if you do that, all of Christianity is responsible for the Inquisition, for the Crusades, for so much evil done in the world under the banner of Christianity. A more modern example, the Jonestown Massacre, that was based in Christianity as well, that cult. So, no. And you can do that, you can go into any faith of any kind. If there's someone who is narcissistic, sociopathic, anything along those lines, psychopathic, whatever, who gets a following and twists things, it can be any group of faith. And I think people of faith are in particular are more vulnerable, in part because we assume the best of people. We don't go into a situation of, what we think are fellow believers with good hearts and assume that someone is trying to manipulate us or do something bad or hurt us and our families. And so we do have trust. And so that's a vulnerability. I think we all need to be aware that just because someone is in our congregation or purports to have similar beliefs does not mean we should be just trusting them implicitly and throwing caution to the wind. I personally have been grateful to see some changes happening in my church, where just small things like every classroom in a chapel now, whether it's for adults or for children, there's a little window in the door now. That is huge. Now, anytime there's a Sunday school class for small children, you always have 2 teachers. Always. And if one teacher can't come one day, then you combine classes and you'll have 3 teachers that day. You never have just one. They're making very concerted efforts to protect children and to believe survivors and that kind of thing. And this case has many times where if only someone had listened. Charles was raising the alarm. Lori's brother Adam was raising the alarm. Heather Daybell was raising the alarm. There were many others along the way. Julia Rowe I should do a video about her. Her book, I think, led to a lot of Chad's crazy. And the church very quickly put out, cause her book was like, oh, wow, this is so cool, near-death whatevers. But the church very quickly saw, oh, no, she's got some creepy, weird stuff. And so they very quickly put out a statement to church teachers saying, do not use her stuff. We do not believe her, endorse her. This is not our beliefs. But Chad took her stuff and ran with it and then adopted a lot of it as his own. Julie Rowe her teachings have split up families, have caused financial ruin. I don't know that she directly is responsible for any deaths, but it was one step further for Chad, just taking Julie's crazy and going with it. She's a piece of work. But I think she has some mental illnesses. I've heard that she has been diagnosed with schizophrenia, but will not medicate herself for it, which explains what she believes are visions and voices speaking to her from the great beyond. We know that they're crap because, well, on so many levels, but one very clear one was when she was defending Chad, when some of the allegations were coming out. She said, well, my spiritual guides and warriors and whoever have told me that Chad is innocent and the children are alive. No, they didn't, clearly. They were found on his property, and she has now distanced herself from Chad.
10.
How were Chad and Laura able to go as far as they were? They flew under the radar. They're quirky. And this is one thing that I think I'll do a video in more detail later, but some people have said that anyone who is going off of the mainstream in any way should be immediately excommunicated. And while I understand where they're coming from on that, because that could have prevented these tragedies, that is an oversimplification of the problem. And if you look back in our history not too far, there was a time where people who were asking questions that today seem very mundane, where you get about early church leaders and Richard Bushman. He's a historian, a Latter-day Saint historian, who wrote a book about Joseph Smith called Rough Stone Rolling, and there's some criticisms and some honest history in there. If that book had been published around 1990, 92, he probably would have been excommunicated for it, because that was an era where anyone who was asking questions and raising alarms was there were people who were silenced. And you can look up the September 6th. This is not a great period in our time. There were 6 people who were considered academics who had turned away and apostatized. And I believe all but one have come back. And one of them actually is a professor at Brigham Young University, and he's a highly respected researcher who should not have been excommunicated for just being an academic and publishing truth. That's the problem. If you see people who are maybe asking hard questions, maybe doing things that might not be entirely mainstream, it's easy to say, well, let's excommunicate them all. But then you get into the situation of excommunicating people who are just trying to do good things. If you wouldn't have women in the positions of leadership that we have today if women hadn't been pushing and asking questions about, the feminist type questions. There's been a lot of movement in the last 5-10 years for women in the church, and that wouldn't have happened if women who had raised questions and posed problems were just kicked out and excommunicated. We've had some movement on LGBTQ things, not enough in my opinion, but institutions move slowly, and I think that will happen eventually. People asking those questions and pushing back today, they shouldn't be excommunicated. So where do you draw that line? It's a hard one. So when you get someone like Chad and Lori, who to most people just seemed quirky, they were acting as regular, normal Latter-day Saints. They were going to church. They were talking mostly in these online forums and these little conferences, which weren't nearly as big as Pryor tried to make them sound. They weren't stadiums. They weren't massive conference centers. It was small. The Rexburg Tabernacle was the biggest I'm aware of, and that holds a maximum of 2,000 people. And I doubt it was full. And they aren't selling tickets either. You can come for free and then buy the book after, is my understanding, because you're not supposed to be selling tickets to a church event or something on a church owned property, and the tabernacle is church owned, unless it's been sold to the city. But it's a hard thing. We do believe in inspiration, but we also believe in free agency, which is the choice, and God can't force a hand. And so God could have been screaming into bishops' ears and stake presidents' ears, and and if they're going, but Chad seems like a nice, quiet guy who couldn't hurt anyone. If they're not listening to that still small voice, Old Testament, that God isn't in the fire and he's not in the roaring wind, he's in the still small voice. So, but even if God had been screaming to them, if they're not open to hearing that Chad is not the guy you think he is, and they're just turning a blind eye to it, what's God supposed to do besides change someone's ability to make a choice? Send down an actual angel to kill Chad? I mean, that's bad. People do bad things and then they're held accountable later, but that's how mortality works, unfortunately. Do you believe in justice in the long term? Those are some of my thoughts. Answer some questions, I hope. Yeah, anyone who says that the church is responsible hasn't thought through Christianity as a whole. Would have to be wiped out then. I don't think anyone is saying that it should be. Just because some people have done bad things in the name of Christ. That's horrible and evil for them, but it is not reflective of the entire belief system. Agree or not? I try to not judge and try to be open. Anyway, I don't speak for the church or anything like that. I'm not trying to evangelize. I'm not trying to convert anybody. I'm just trying to add context and explain, and hopefully add some insight. So if you made it this far, please give this video a like, subscribe to the channel. It really helps people to find it, and to hopefully spread the word a bit. Get the notification bell hit so that you don't miss a single video. As I always say, as we go into so much bitter, grab yourself something sweet to get through it.